The Falcons have interviewed all 6 GM candidates, and now I guess we wait.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. I am, of course, your humble host, Aaron Freeman. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at FalFans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's episode, we're going to catch you up on the latest with the GM search over the last 48 hours since we last talked to you about it, as well as preview some of the top wide receivers that I'll be having my eyes on in Mobile this week. Sort of my initial impressions of 7 prospects that I've watched and what I want to see from them potentially this week as part of their evaluation process. But as you can tell, if you're watching on YouTube, we are here from a undisclosed location in Mobile, Alabama. Let's talk about the GM search. I had to get down to Mobile a little bit early to avoid, Winter Storm 2026. But I was thinking there was a decent chance that by the time I was doing this show for you guys Sunday night on YouTube, Monday morning on the rest of your audio feeds, that we'd be talking about the new GM hire, because the Falcons finished all their GM interviews on Friday and Saturday of this past week. They interviewed 6 guys. We talked about, a couple of those guys on Friday with Jarvis Davis of the pod. And, as we were recording, it was announced that Joe Douglas was another candidate. So let's talk a little bit about Joe Douglas. I've seen a lot of sort of negative reaction to the idea that the Falcons have shown interest in Joe Douglas. He's the only one of these 6 candidates that has previous experience as an NFL GM, serving in that role for, I believe, 5 years in the New York Jets, from 2020 to 2024. Basically, he was there for the Saleh era and the very end of the Adam Gase era. I think Joe Douglas, in my honest opinion, I thought he was a really good drafter in New York. I thought he did a really good job drafting there. For the most part, again, nobody's perfect or anything, but I thought did a really good job building up that defense. It was one of the best defenses in the NFL, primarily built through the draft. The big downfall of Joe Douglas was him whiffing on the Zach Wilson pick, and certainly that is going to be something that may leave a bitter taste in a lot of Falcon fans' mouth, because we're sitting here, as we discussed the other day on Friday when we did our thorough breakdown of Michael Penix, the Falcons potentially could be in the market for a new franchise quarterback, and Joe Douglas's hit rate on that is not particularly high, but that kind of is applicable to every GM except for the ones that actually have succeeded. And as I've said before on this podcast, I think a lot of people don't realize that hitting on a quarterback is kind of luck-based and necessarily skill-based. But, it will be interesting to see if the Falcons are interested in Joe Douglas. I saw someone online try to connect the dots between Joe Douglas having the same representation as whoever, I don't know, Kevin Stefanski or somebody else. Somebody else is already in the Falcons building that has similar reputation, or some of the other guys that the Falcons are looking at has representation. So it was kind of like, hey, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Let's see if we can get Joe Douglas back in the fold. Comes from that Eagles background, Ravens background as well. So he checks a lot of the same boxes that Ian Cunningham and Andy Weidel as well check as well. But something that somebody brought up recently to me on Friday, and I didn't realize this, but I just thought it was interesting. And because I'm pouring cold water on the conspiracy against Shedeur Sanders here on the podcast, so I might as well light the fire under another conspiracy, and that is that Rich McKay is still pulling the strings here, because someone made the connection that I didn't realize. They were connecting the dots. You've heard various rumors out there that, Josh Williams alongside Ian Cunningham, Josh Williams, the director of scouting and football ops for the 49ers, is potentially a front runner for the Falcons vacant GM job. Josh Williams obviously spent a lot of time, like 15 years as a scout in San Francisco, and recently has been promoted to his current role under John Lynch. John Lynch has a close relationship with Rich McKay, right? Rich McKay drafted John Lynch when Rich McKay was the general manager of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the 1990s, right? John Lynch, when he got the job as the 49ers GM back in 2017, I believe Rich McKay was like fully endorsing it, pounding the table, all that sort of stuff. So you're just like, okay, if we're still in the Rich McKay era. Allegedly, Rich McKay has nothing to do. He's not in the room. He's not. But this is kind of the last Hail Mary shot, seemingly. If you are conspiracy minded, and I'm not wearing my tinfoil hat, I'm just wearing a beanie just because I don't want you guys to see how shiny. I got overhead lights, and that shine on the dome is going to be way too distracting. So I'm wearing a beanie instead of my tinfoil hat. But if you are inclined to the tinfoil that Rich McKay is still, pulling the strings secretly in the background here in Atlanta. You hear this buzz about Josh Williams. You're like, that's interesting. So we will see. But the Falcons seemingly should hire a GM shortly. We'll see if they get that between now and Tuesday when Kevin Stefanski is supposed to meet with the media. You would assume that if the goal was to, bring that GM and have, two prominent people in the building now, the two of the three pillars in terms of the decision makers with the GM and the head coach in that presser on Tuesday, that they probably would have announced that. Now, of course, I say that, and then as I'm uploading this episode, they will announce it. But I'll say this: if they do wind up announcing it over the course of whatever, the next few days, we're probably not going to do a live reaction to it, just because down here in Mobile, our internet connection is not strong. And so streaming a live breakdown of that is probably not going to work for us. And it's, it's a GM job. Like, what are we going to say? Like, what can we say? Like, oh, this guy's background says this, and we'll see if he does that. Like, that's a 15-minute conversation, not necessarily a full, 30+ minute breakdown on that. So we'll see what's what with the Falcons GM search. If they decide to do a second round of interviews, they've done the first round. Do they need to do more? Technically, Josh Williams and Ian Cunningham have done 2 now interviews, first with the president of football at the beginning of the month, now with the GM job. Do they bring in some in-person interviews? They've done all these ones over Zoom over the last 48 hours. So we'll see on that front. But we're just kind of waiting and seeing when the Falcons bring a general manager into the building. It seems like it should be any day now, any minute now, any hour now. So we'll all be, checking our phone notifications and whatnot to see if that move is officially made. But that's going to be it until we get that move or, get some updates on what the Falcons process is going to be. And we'll move on to talk about what is going to be the bulk of our conversation all week long here on Locked On Falcons, which is, of course, the Senior Bowl, where the Falcons will be potentially in the market for a wide receiver. And we'll look at 7 prospects, including the top prospect here in Mobile, which is Texas A&M wide receiver Casey Concepcion, and sort of what I'm looking from him and others as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So with the big game almost here, there's no better way to stay locked into every moment than with PrizePicks, the daily fantasy app where it always feels good to be right. With football season in its final stretch, it's the perfect time to close it out strong. Build simple lineups around player projections. No drafts, no waiting, just football action all the way through the playoffs. PrizePicks is an incredibly easy way to get started. All you got to do is pick 2 or more players and choose more or less on their stat projections. It's a great way to keep, that fantasy football vibe going after your season-long leagues have long finished. So check it out by downloading the PrizePicks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. PrizePicks, it is good to be right. And what if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when the momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. So before we continue today's episode, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of Locked On Falcons. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And if you want to level up your everydayerness, you can do so by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for $5 a month, $50 a year. You get a lot of perks, including Discord access, where you can get some of my thoughts on the Senior Bowl stuff as myself and several other Locked On hosts that will be here in Mobile will be, giving our draft thoughts. And you can be part of the conversation with so many other everydayers across the Locked On Podcast Network. So go check it out in the link in the description below. So let's talk about Senior Bowl. And, I've done almost no draft homework, guys. This is the very beginning. And so I don't want this to come off as like, this is the definitive take. This is like step one in a 47-step process that we're going to go through over the course of this offseason. And this is just kind of my initial impression of 7 guys that I've watched a little bit of that kind of stood out to me because they check some of the boxes that I'm kind of looking for the Falcons' next wide receiver, which is they either have size, they either have speed, they either can generate yards after the catch, and that's one of the things that we're looking for. We talked about this earlier last week when we talked about the wide receiver. Like we want to build a wide receiver room around Drake London that complements Drake London. We're going to spend a lot of money potentially this offseason on Drake London. And you want to, build some complementary pieces. You want a guy, and we talked about sort of the guys that we're looking for. Drake London, even though he's a great jump ball catcher down the field, he's not necessarily a guy that's going to burn you. So we want to get a guy that has that speed that scares defenses. Drake London, he fights for every yard after the catch, but he's not a guy that is also going to, run away from guys and be that super dynamic guy that's going to make a ton of guys miss in the open field. He's just going to lower his pads and try to run over guys. And so we're looking for guys that can also generate those explosives off of, yak and whatnot. And, the other thing we mentioned the other day, which is, my preference for kind of outside guys, right? Me, I want to put Drake London in the slot as much as possible. And so, looking at some of these guys. And so these 7 guys were kind of guys that when I was doing my research over the weekend and sort of, they kind of stood out. They checked at least one of these boxes that I'm looking for. And so that's why initially I did a deep dive into them, or they're at least the more touted prospects going into this Senior Bowl week. But the Senior Bowl, before we get into the breakdown, the Senior Bowl is notable because I think a lot of people look at the Senior Bowl as like, oh, who's the best guy at practice? And I think really the Senior Bowl is an evaluation too. You're trying to find answers to questions that you have about each prospect, right? And, as we go through this, because I've only dipped my toe into this, my evaluation and whatnot of these prospects could be off the mark. But, it's like, for example, what am I talking about? In the past, when we've done these Senior Bowl breakdowns and looking at the trenches, like when we're looking at offensive linemen, if you go and watch that guy's film in college and you're like, oh, he really struggles against speed, but he's really good against power. And then he gets to the Senior Bowl and he's locking down all the guys that are trying to bull rush him. You didn't learn anything new. But if he's locking down the speed rushers, you did learn something new. And so that to me is what we're really looking at. It's like, are we learning new things about these prospects? Are there questions? A great example that I can use is Quinyon Mitchell. Going back a couple of years ago at the Senior Bowl. When you remember, if you were an everydayer back then, we talked about how he was basically the best guy at practices that week. But like Quinyon Mitchell at Toledo was basically an off-zone corner. And so the question about Quinyon Mitchell was, how can he handle press man? So in Senior Bowl week, he was playing a ton of press man, and he was basically shutting down everybody. And we're like, okay, he checked that box with flying colors. So that's what I mean when I'm saying, like, you want to answer the right questions rather than just saying, oh, this guy looked good in practice. It's like, okay, but why did he look good in practice? Did he do something that we already knew he did? Now, that being said, let's talk about who is the consensus top wide receiver here in Mobile. That is Texas A&M wide receiver Casey Concepcion. Potential first rounder based off of his consensus rankings, sort of in the 28 to 32 range on like Dane Brugler's board and PFF's board and other boards that I've seen and whatnot. So definitely a potential first round pick. So maybe not in the table for the Falcons at pick 48, but could he slide? Who knows? And are the Falcons potentially going to get a first round talent if they were to pull the trigger on it? I watched a little bit of Casey Concepcion last summer when he was at NC State, and I was like, this is a dynamic yak guy. That's really the box that Casey Concepcion checks, right? He transferred to Texas A&M this year. They asked him to return punts. He took 2 to the house, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of, again, these are initial impressions, not necessarily don't want to be married to them, just kind of my initial impressions. But I was getting a little bit of Deebo Samuel vibes. And so to me, the question for him going into the Senior Bowl week is, he's got a smaller stature. Does he have the route running polish, right? How does he handle press man coverage, right? Like those are some of the questions I have about Casey Concepcion that I think he could answer really well this week. We know he can be dynamic with the ball in his hands, but in those one-on-ones in practice, like that's not really something that you're looking for. So it's like, can you separate? Can you get open? Can you catch the ball and then create those yak opportunities? Or are you going to be more of a, gadget guy at the next level? Can you be a true wide receiver? That's the question. Now, a guy that is truly a gadget guy that we want to talk about next, in contrast to Casey Concepcion, because I think Casey has the potential to be more, which is why I'm comparing him to Deebo Samuel, is Colin Lacey. Colin Lacey from Louisville, I believe. And I don't know if Colin Lacey is a wide receiver. I think he's a running back. There's always a guy like this at the Senior Bowl. Malachi Coley was a guy a couple of years ago. I think Savion Williams was here last year. There's always some running back at the Senior Bowl that is masquerading as a wide receiver. Right. And I say that because like Colin Lacey's game is very similar to Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore to me was a running back masquerading as a wide receiver, dynamic with the ball in his hands, dynamic return specialist, very similar to Casey Concepcion. But to me, the question with Colin Lacey, given his smaller stature, is he a wide receiver or is he just a running back? I saw a couple of plays where he would line up at running in the backfield and take a handoff, wildcat quarterback. And I'm like, that's running back stuff. That's not wide receiver stuff. He like almost all his ADOT is like extremely low. And I forget the number where it is, but it's basically like, I remember looking it up years ago because I was getting into an argument with my guy, Kevin Knight, over at the Falcoholic about Malachi Corley and him being a running back. I'm like, stop drafting running backs to play wide receiver. Cordero Patterson, Malachi Corley, Rondale Moore, Felix Jones, the list goes on and on. Like this player does not work in the NFL. But one of the indicators is you look at a guy's average depth of target, their ADOT. Average depth of target. And I forget the exact number, but I think it's like 7 or 8 their final year in college. Like the last time a guy had a dot below that number and turned into a good NFL wide receiver, I think was Stephon Diggs. And it's like everybody else who's just a screen guy, it's like, are you a running back? Right. Where like you're in college and you're being asked to do running back things with screens. And in college, you can do that because in the collegiate level, on average, they run like 2 or 3 times more screens than they do in the NFL level. And that becomes a challenge for those guys in the NFL because they're not polished wide receivers and they have to be gadget guys. And so that's the question I'm going to have for Colin Lacey. Are you just a running back? And I'm intrigued as a running back. I was intrigued by Rondale Moore as a running back. I just had no interest in those guys being wide receivers and basically being slot merchants in that regard. The third guy is another undersized guy, but I think is a little bit more polished as a true wide receiver is Brennan Thompson, Casey Concepcion's teammate over at Texas A&M. Small, deep threat. The vibes I was getting is Wan'Dale Robinson, right? A guy that has a lot of speed, but also is an effective deep threat, right? He has the best deep ball numbers of anybody at the Senior Bowl. Primarily a deep threat, but that's going to be a challenge, I think, because of his smaller stature. Again, I'm not throwing out numbers because I'm going to wait till the measurables come out and then we can be a little bit more accurate rather than what they're listed at. And then you come to find out that like they're 3 inches shorter or taller, 15 pounds heavier, or, whatever. So we'll see on that front. But he's a smaller guy. Typically smaller guys aren't always the most dynamic deep threats in the NFL just because just physics, without getting into it, makes it hard for a short guy to catch a football deep unless he has like blazing 4.29 speed. And so I wonder if Brennan Thompson is going to be as effective a deep threat in the NFL as he is, but he's fast. And, we can work with fast. and you saw this with Rondell Robinson, who in the previous years was more of a gadget screen guy, underneath slot guy. And then this past year with Malik Neighbors out, was asked to be much more of a vertical explosive threat. And Wandale, I'm sorry, if you go back to his days at Kentucky, that's what he did at Kentucky quite a bit. And he was able to showcase that ability. And so that's kind of where I could see Brendan Thompson being. So we'll see, to me, this week is going to be great to see how does he match up with the size and the speed. Can he just kind of run past guys? Can he, mix it up physically, win those contested catch situations? I think he's more of a true wide receiver than Colin Lacey is, but we'll see how that measures up. And so those are just 3 of the 7 wide receivers that I want to talk about that are more of those yak guys that we're talking about. And then the next is more of the big-bodied guys, because I'm out here. As I said, I don't want to force Drake London to be an X wide receiver in this offense. He can do it, but I don't want him to do that primarily. And so I'm on the lookout for another X wide receiver. But there's another prospect here that may be the consensus number 2 prospect behind Casey Concepcion. That's Elijah Surratt of Indiana, that almost is identical to Drake London. And again, it begs the question of, is 2 Drake Londons better than 1? And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, we know the Falcons' hiring history when it comes to coaching is not so illustrious. They often find someone who looks pretty good on paper, but then they find out down the road he's not the right fit. If only the NFL had Indeed sponsored jobs, today's sponsor, to help their teams find the right match. Now, if you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. Indeed sponsored jobs is great because according to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now. Support the show by saying that you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, let's talk about Elijah Surratt, the Indiana wide receiver. We talked about him a little bit the other day with Jarvis, and sort of I made the mistake of confusing him with the sophomore wide receiver, Charlie Becker. And I thought for some reason, again, I didn't watch any college football this year, guys. Too busy dealing with it. So I was like, oh, that guy who's making all the plays in the national championship game, that's Elijah Surratt. That's the other good receiver. And it's Charlie Becker, the guy who's not draft eligible. Surratt had a quiet game, but he's probably the consensus number 2 guy going into the Senior Bowl week. And his skill set, watching him, it's like this is Drake London, this is Cooper Kupp, this is a big slot, big time red zone threat, 15 touchdowns this past season. And so to me, the question with Elijah Surratt is like, are you more than just a big slot? Because I'm looking at his skill set and I'm like, this is a perfect, if you're looking for a Drake London type in your offense that can really major in being a big slot, he can do that. The question, as we know with Drake London and why Drake London was a top 10 pick and all that stuff, is Drake London can do more than that. And if Elijah Surratt can't do more than that, that's probably going to limit him to being more of that day 2 guy. And so that's going to be something that I have my eye on. But, if you operate under the assumption that, hey, having 2 interchangeable, a rich man's Drake London and a middle class man's Drake London, which is Elijah Surratt, and that's the best way to build your offense, then I think you're going to be very intrigued by Elijah Surratt this week. And so I'll be curious to see how he performs. Then the next guy is probably maybe the most talented guy in Mobile this week in terms of just like pure upside, and is the most intriguing guy, is Jacoby Lane from USC. He's got a big build, tall guy, big body, built like a classic X wide receiver, but based off of the film I've watched at USC, the other wide receiver who's projected to be a potential top 15, top 20 pick, Mekhi Lemon, plays more of the X on that line of scrimmage role. We broke this down in the wide receiver breakdown last week, difference between an X and a Z, and Lane plays more of that Z role, which is off the line of scrimmage. So he's not dealing with press coverage. So I want to kind of see him, use that size to beat press coverage. He's got the skills. He's not the most explosive guy in and out of his breaks, but he's a big, he looks the part when you're looking for size and speed. I think Jacoby Lane checks those boxes amongst these Senior Bowl prospects. And so, the vibes I got a little bit was with George Pickens. He's not quite the contested catch guy that George Pickens is. But that type of big body wide receiver that could be a really effective number two, that if he can show he can play that X receiver role, you know me, because then we'll get Drake at the Z and moving him all over the place, and he's our joker, and then you just post Jacoby Lane at the X and just like, hey, Jacoby, go down the field, pull a little bit of that George Pickens magic, and we'll just throw it up to you and catch the football. So he's the guy that, to me, that I'm hoping that as we sit here at the end of the week, I'm singing the praises of, as that's the guy who I want at pick 48, at least among the Senior Bowl guys, as we break into the rest of the wide receiver film throughout the offseason. So that's what I'm hoping to get and be impressed. It's similar last year when we talk about the edge rushers and, Donovan Ezeraku and Mike Green and, Princely Umanmielen was kind of the guy that I had penciled in going into the week, and then he had a quiet week, and it was like, oh, Princely, you disappointed me. But I'm hoping Jacoby Lane, does not follow down the Princely, rabbit hole. I was going to say lane, and I was like, that's too lame of a pun to make. But, let's move on to Malachi Fields, who is kind of the lesser big-bodied X wide receiver. I saw a little bit of him. He's at Notre Dame this past year. He transferred from Virginia. I saw a little bit of him at Virginia just because when I was watching Xavier Watts last year, they played Virginia, and I was like, hey, who's this big guy? Oh, he transferred to Notre Dame. He'll be a guy to keep an eye on. Now, to me, the knock on Malachi Fields is I question the separation skills. Right? He seems more of that Auden Tate, Donovan Peoples-Jones type of contested catch guys, but question if they can really separate. And is that a number two wide receiver, or is that really more of a number three type of guy? Right? But he has strong hands, reliable target. If you're looking for another guy that can be a potential red zone threat, I think Malachi Fields checked those boxes. And so, again, the question for me is going to be, can you separate reliably during this week in the Senior Bowl in these one-on-ones? So that will be something to keep an eye on. And then the last guy, the seventh guy on my list, is Ted Hurst, another big body guy from Georgia State, the local guy, right? Here in Atlanta, another tall guy, long strider. So I think he has a little bit more speed than, say, Malachi Fields does. The question I have with Ted Hurst watching the film was his release package doesn't seem to be all the way there. He just kind of just accelerates into his route, which is not a problem. But I think he gets away with that at the lower level of competition. So really the Senior Bowl week is going to be just like, is there jumping competition playing at Georgia State in the Sun Belt going to be something that is a challenge for him, or does he overcome that? Sort of, again, the vibes I got a little bit was Kenny Golladay in terms of how tall and how he moved. Golladay was much more effective as a big slot than I'm necessarily projecting Ted Hurst to be, which I'm potentially projecting as more of that X type of receiver. So these four guys, Surratt, Lane, Fields, Hurst, I'm curious if they could fill that role as that X wide receiver, potentially replacing someone like Darnell Mooney in the offense with a much bigger, more physical sort of classic X, as opposed to the speedy, explosive X that Darnell Mooney was in this offense, and give the Falcons another big body that can, take some of the pressure off of Drake London on those third downs down the field and in the red zone. So those four guys kind of stood out to me in terms of potential X options, but we'll see who else pops at this wide receiver position. I'll be watching obviously more guys. I think there's like 14 guys that are going to be here. We'll see what these guys measure up to be tomorrow. I think we'll be breaking into the corners that will be locking these guys down potentially in the one-on-ones. Hopefully I'll be able to get, a half dozen cornerback film to watch in the next 24 hours to break those guys down before we get into practices on Tuesday. So I appreciate you guys for, staying with me here on this, and we'll have you covered all week long here down in Mobile, Alabama. I hope for everyone out there that is dealing with the winter weather down south and across the country, I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you guys are doing all right. I know it could be a challenge. It's been wet, but not too bad here in Mobile, which is why, you had to escape, and get down here. So we'll see on that front, but appreciate you guys. And we'll be back tomorrow with talking about some of the corners as well as give you guys any updates on, any other Falcons related news. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL. You want to get the scoop on all of the conference championship action as I sit here recording to you. So I don't know who won the NFC. I do know who won the AFC. It will be the New England Patriots. And will we get, either way, we're going to get a nice rematch. Rams, Patriots, Rams, Seahawks. Patriots, Seahawks. We're going to get, someone's going to get the revenge on the New England Patriots potentially in the Super Bowl. So compelling battle, but Locked On NFL is going to have it covered for you. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below, lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, $5 a month or $50 a year. You get great perks like Discord access to Locked On Podcast Network. Talk trash to Saints fans with me. Let's wade into that thing together. An ad-free version of Locked On Falcons audio podcast, as well as merch for Locked On Podcast Network and so much more perks. So go check it out at the link in the description below. Guys, it is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every